In 2020, millions of investors sold when the market crashed, locking in losses of 30% or more. Within 5 months, the market had fully recovered. The people who stayed invested got their money back. The ones who sold didn't just take the loss, they missed the recovery too. And that's where the real damage happened. Because once you're out, you have to decide when to get back in. And most people get that decision wrong as well. So what started as a temporary drop turns into a permanent setback. Years of progress, gone in a few decisions that felt completely justified at the time. And here's the part most people misunderstand. That decision to sell wasn't really about strategy. It felt rational. It felt careful. It felt like the right move. But something else was driving it. And once you see what that is, you start to realize how easily it can happen again, even if you think you'd handle it differently. In this video, I'm going to break down what actually causes investors to make that decision, and how to avoid turning the next downturn into a mistake you can't recover from. You probably already know the advice. Buy and hold, don't time the market, write it out. And you probably believe it, not just as a concept, but genuinely. You've read it. You've nodded along to it. You might have said it out loud to someone else who was panicking and felt pretty confident that you meant it. But there's a gap between knowing something and being able to execute it under pressure. And in personal finance, that gap is wider than most people are willing to admit before they experience it firsthand. Vanguard's behavioral research has tracked what actually happens when markets drop hard and fast, and the picture isn't flattering. A meaningful portion of investors who report high confidence in their ability to stay the course during a hypothetical market downturn don't actually stay the course when the downturn is real. The intellectual conviction they had sitting comfortably during normal times doesn't show up with the same force when the number on the screen is moving the wrong direction every single day for 3 weeks straight. What's actually happening is something specific and predictable, running in a part of your brain that financial advice has never been aimed at. The logic of buy and hold is correct. The problem is that the logic gets delivered to your prefrontal cortex, which is not the system that takes over when everything feels like it's on fire. Your prefrontal cortex knows to buy and hold. Your amygdala doesn't speak that language. And when the threat signal hits hard enough, those two systems aren't running a committee meeting. One of them just takes over. What that means for your money and why it's costing investors far more than they realize is something Dalbar has been measuring for over 20 years. There's a report that the investment research firm Dalbar publishes annually called the Quantitative Analysis of Investor Behavior. It has been running since 1994, and it tracks one specific thing: the difference between what the market returns and what the average investor actually earns. That gap is stubborn, and it doesn't respond to the things you'd expect. More accessible investing tools haven't closed it. More sophisticated financial media hasn't closed it. The average investor consistently underperforms the market, not because they chose bad funds or paid high fees, but because of what they do with their accounts when volatility spikes. In 2022, the S&P 500 finished down about 18% for the year. The average equity fund investor finished down closer to 21%. They didn't absorb the same loss as the market. They absorbed more because they were making moves. Selling when things looked bad, sitting out some of the recoveries, getting back in late. Over a 30-year period in Dalbar's data through the early 2020s, the S&P 500 compounded at roughly 10% annually. The average equity investor compounded at closer to 6%. Run those two numbers on a $100,000 starting balance over 30 years, and you get a difference of more than $700,000. For a lot of people, that gap is the difference between having options in their 60s and not having them. The cause wasn't bad fund selection or high fees. It was behavior during a handful of volatile weeks spread across a 30-year investing life. The cause of that gap, according to Dalbar's analysis year after year, is behavioral. Fees matter at the margins, fund selection matters a little, but neither explains a 4-point annual return gap compounding over 3 decades. What explains it is voluntary exits from the market during periods of peak fear, followed by delayed or mistimed re-entry. Selling low, and then either staying out too long or buying back in after the recovery has already happened. The market, left alone, eventually recovers. The investor who intervened doesn't benefit from that recovery. And most people who exit during a panic don't just sit in cash calmly waiting for a clear signal. They stay out through the anxiety, re-enter tentatively when things feel stable, and then watch what they bought start dropping again because economic cycles don't care about your emotional timeline. The market wasn't the problem. The decision made in the middle of peak fear was the problem. and understanding where that decision actually comes from changes everything about what you can do to prevent it. When a market drops hard, not a short-term dip that bounces back in a week, but a real sustained decline that goes down for days and then weeks with no clear floor, something specific happens in your nervous system that no one in mainstream financial advice explains with any precision. Your brain's threat detection system is centered in a structure called the amygdala, and it does not distinguish particularly well between different types of danger. Physical threat, social threat, financial threat. The activation pattern is similar enough that the emotional output feels the same. Loss aversion, the phenomenon that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky documented through decades of research at Princeton and Stanford, shows that the psychological pain of losing a given amount of money hits roughly twice as hard as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. That asymmetry is deeply wired. It likely has evolutionary roots in the fact that our ancestors who were more sensitive to loss survived longer than those who weren't. The problem is that the market didn't exist in the ancestral environment, and the calibration for dangerous loss is way too sensitive for a portfolio fluctuation. But there's a layer to this that makes market panics even more destructive than most people understand. Loss aversion doesn't work on a timer. The pain of a paper loss doesn't stabilize once you've intellectually accepted that you're holding for the long term. It resets. Every morning you open your brokerage app and see a lower number, your brain processes that as a new loss event, not as a continuation of the one you already processed. By day 10 of a steep decline, you're not experiencing one large loss. You're experiencing 10 consecutive days of distinct loss signals, each hitting with something close to the same intensity as the first. The cumulative weight of that is enormous, and the behavioral science on how long people can withstand sustained aversive stimuli before taking action to end it is not encouraging. Psychologists refer to availability cascade as the process by which recent, vivid, emotionally charged events become disproportionately weighted in your decision-making. During a severe market drop, your recency bias is running at full capacity. A portfolio that's been declining for 3 weeks doesn't feel like a temporary fluctuation in the context of a long investment horizon. It feels like evidence of what's really happening. Your brain starts pulling up the worst financial scenarios it has access to. The 2008 financial crisis, the dot-com collapse, the Great Depression, not as distant historical events, but as pattern templates, as things that happened before and could be happening again right now. And this is where the mechanism becomes genuinely hard to catch in real time. In that neurological state, with loss aversion compounding daily, the availability cascade selecting for worst-case outcomes, and threat detection running at maximum activation, the decision to sell doesn't feel like emotional panic. It feels like an informed, rational response to a deteriorating situation, like you're gathering new evidence, updating your assessment, and making a responsible adjustment. The internal experience of panic selling and the internal experience of disciplined risk management feel remarkably similar from the inside. That's what makes this so hard to catch in yourself. The mechanism doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as logic. And the more sophisticated you are as an investor, the better you are at generating a coherent narrative for why this time is different and why getting out now is actually the smart move. This is where the research gets uncomfortable, because the people most likely to make a panic selling decision aren't the people who ignore their investments. They're the people who are paying close attention. Think about it from a behavioral exposure standpoint. If you check your portfolio once a month, you experience 12 loss signals per year in a declining market. If you're engaged, tracking market news daily, checking your balance whenever a notable market move happens, which during a downturn is every single day, you're experiencing 50, 70, 100 or more discrete loss registrations over the same period. Dalbar's research and the broader behavioral finance literature have consistently found that investment activity spikes during high volatility periods, and the investors who are most active during those periods are not the least informed ones. They're among the most informed, most engaged, most financially attentive people in the market. The sophistication doesn't insulate you from the mechanism. In some cases, it actively increases your exposure to it. Because being financially sophisticated also means you have more sophisticated stories available to justify what you're feeling. You can connect the current drop to macroeconomic indicators, historical parallels, structural risks. The reasoning sounds more airtight than "I'm scared." But underneath the analysis, the same neurological sequence is running. There's a deeper layer to this that most people don't look at directly. When you watch your portfolio fall during a sustained downturn, part of what's being threatened isn't just the balance. It's the narrative you have about yourself as someone who handles money responsibly. You built a plan. You made contributions. You diversified. You did the things that careful, thoughtful people do. And now the number on your screen appears to be telling you that something went wrong, that the plan isn't working the way it was supposed to. For people who tie their sense of competence and responsibility to their financial behavior, and research by Brad Klontz at Kansas State shows that this identity attachment is extremely common among high-achieving adults, a sustained portfolio decline doesn't just threaten the money. It threatens the self-image, the version of yourself who is on track, who made smart choices, who is different from the people who didn't bother. That version is suddenly being called into question by the data on your screen. Selling in that moment feels like reasserting the narrative, like doing something intelligent before the situation deteriorates further. What it actually does is crystallize a paper loss into a permanent one, remove you from the recovery that follows almost every major market decline, and then set up what is arguably the worst part of the whole sequence. You now have to decide when to get back in. That re-entry problem is what most people don't fully account for when they think about the cost of panic selling, because the moment you exit, your psychological relationship with the market changes. Now, you're not a long-term investor riding out volatility. You're someone sitting in cash who needs to make a timing call, and that timing call carries exactly the same emotional weight as the one that got you out. Only now you're trying to find a moment of enough stability to feel justified re-entering, and markets don't produce those moments on request. Most panic sellers, according to Dalbar's re-entry timing data, wait until conditions feel safe. Conditions feeling safe typically means prices have already recovered substantially, which means they locked in the loss and missed a substantial portion of the rebound. That's the cycle. People who swore after 2008 that they'd never make that mistake again made the same mistake in 2020. The intellectual lesson from the last crash doesn't override the amygdala response during the next one, not without something more structural in place. If this is already hitting close to home, take a second and subscribe. New videos every week on exactly why your brain makes money harder than it needs to be. And because the hardest part of this isn't knowing the problem, it's knowing what to actually do differently when the next crash comes. That's where we're going next. The standard response to everything covered so far is some version of stay calm, think long-term, don't make emotional decisions. And that advice, while technically correct, is about as useful as telling someone in the middle of a panic attack to just breathe normally. The logic is sound. The problem is which system it's being delivered to. Neuroscience research from Joseph Ledoux at NYU, who has spent his career studying the amygdala's role in fear and threat response, shows that the emotional response to a threat signal arrives in the brain approximately 120 to 150 milliseconds before the prefrontal cortex even begins its conscious evaluation of the situation. The part of your brain that wants to sell gets the signal first. By the time your reasoning brain is constructing a counter-argument, the emotional response has already begun shaping your perception of the options. You're not making a purely rational decision that then gets influenced by emotions. You're making an emotionally inflected decision that then gets rationalized. You can't think your way out of a response that arrived before the thinking started, but you can build the architecture of the decision before the threat state arrives. Behavioral economists call this pre-commitment. It's the idea that you make binding decisions about your future behavior during a calm, rational state so that the future version of you under stress doesn't have to start from scratch. Richard Thaler, whose work in behavioral economics earned him the Nobel Prize in 2017, documented how systematically people make better long-term decisions when they pre-commit to rules during low-stress conditions than when they try to make the same decisions in real time under pressure. In practical terms, this means a few specific things that most investors don't actually do. The first is a written investment policy statement, not a mental note, an actual document written in advance that specifies exactly what you will and won't do when the market drops by specific percentages. At 10% down, you rebalance. At 20% down, you increase contributions if cash flow allows. Under no circumstances do you sell holdings in your long-term accounts regardless of what you're feeling or what the news is saying. When that document exists, and you've committed to it in writing during a calm period, it becomes the decision you made when you were thinking clearly, and it serves as a counterweight to the certainty you're going to feel during the next drop that getting out is the right call. The second is friction. One of the most underappreciated behavioral tools in personal finance is the simple act of adding steps between impulse and execution. Vanguard's research on investor behavior found that automatic investment programs, the kind where contributions continue without any action required during downturns, dramatically outperform accounts where the investor has to make an active choice each period. The reason is that during normal conditions, people actively contribute. During panic conditions, they stop. Automatic programs eliminate the active choice and replace it with default continuation. The investor who panics has to actively override the automation to exit. Most don't. They just feel bad for a while and stay invested. The third is a restriction on checking. This one is harder for engaged investors because it feels irresponsible, but the data is clear. Monitoring frequency during volatile periods is one of the strongest behavioral predictors of panic selling. Ulrika Malmendier at UC Berkeley, whose research examines how personal experiences shape economic decisions, found that investors who experienced major market downturns as young adults developed systematically more risk-averse behaviors for decades afterward. The more you watch a declining market, the more your recency bias loads it with meaning. Setting a rule like once-a-week maximum portfolio checks during volatile periods, paired with a specific checklist of decisions you are and are not allowed to make, reduces exposure to the availability cascade before it can build to a tipping point. The architecture does what the willpower can't. Not because it makes you a better, calmer, more disciplined investor, but because it removes the decisions that your threat-activated brain shouldn't be making. There's a specific number worth sitting with before we bring this to a close. If you invested $50,000 in a broad S&P 500 index fund at the start of 2020, and you sold in March at the bottom when the market was down roughly 34%, you locked in a loss of around $17,000. You walked away with approximately $33,000. Now let's say you were more cautious than the average panic seller, and only waited 6 months to get back in. That's actually faster re-entry than Dalbar's data shows for the typical investor coming out of a panic exit. But even at 6 months, the S&P 500 had largely recovered to where it started. You were buying the same index at roughly the same prices you sold it at, except now you had $17,000 less to deploy. You didn't lose that money to the market. The market came back. You lost it to the decision made inside a 72-hour window around the worst days of the decline, the window when the availability cascade hit its peak, when the loss signals were arriving at maximum frequency, when every check of the account was adding another data point to the brain's threat assessment. That's the window where Dalbar's analysis places the majority of panic selling activity. Not when markets first start falling, when the falling has been happening long enough that stopping feels impossible. And the harder truth is that this window is not a historical footnote. It's a recurring feature of how markets work. There have been 20% or greater drawdowns in the U.S. market in 1987, 2001, 2002, 2008, 2009, 2011, 2018, 2020, and 2022. That's 9 instances of major panic-eligible volatility in roughly 35 years. Morningstar's long-term market data puts the average frequency of a 20% or greater decline at roughly once every 3 to 5 years over extended historical periods. The next one isn't a possibility you need to prepare for abstractly. It's a scheduled event on a timeline you don't have advance access to. The question isn't whether you'll face that window again. You will. The question is whether you'll enter it with architecture in place, or whether you'll enter it the same way most people do, with the genuine belief that this time you'll handle it differently, and then find yourself in month 2 of a decline with the same neurological sequence running that you swore after the last crash you'd figured out. Because your brain in that window will feel certain. It won't feel like panic. It will feel like clarity, like you're finally seeing things accurately after a period of wishful thinking. The internal experience will be persuasive in a way that's hard to describe until you've been inside it. The only thing that reliably beats that feeling isn't stronger conviction, better market knowledge, or more emotional self-awareness. It's a decision that was already made, on paper, during a week when none of this felt urgent. That's the mistake. A single decision made in a 72-hour window of maximum threat activation that can cost years of compounding and set back a retirement timeline by more than the average investor ever calculates when they think about what the drop cost them. You know what it is now, why it happens, and what to build before the window opens again. You didn't fail when it mattered most. You ran a biological sequence that nobody warned you about clearly enough, and that sequence is older and faster than any financial advice you've ever received. You are a person running hardware that was built for a very different kind of threat than a fluctuating portfolio balance, and nobody in mainstream financial education told you clearly enough that the feelings you experience during a sustained market decline are neurologically indistinguishable from being in genuine physical danger. The sense of urgency is real. The certainty is real. The feeling that doing something is more protective than doing nothing is real. And it's a mismatch between your brain's design and the environment it's operating in. The system wasn't built for you. The emotional architecture of panic selling is a predictable biological sequence, not a personal shortcoming that Dalbar's data shows has cost the average investor between 3 and 4% annually across decades. Over a 30-year investing horizon that compounds into a number that is, for most people, larger than any single financial mistake they'll ever make intentionally. The gap isn't dramatic. It doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates quietly, one panic decision per crash cycle, until the retirement math stops working out the way the projections said it would. So the work isn't to become a more disciplined, emotionally controlled investor. The work is to build the decision before you need it. Write the policy statement. Set the architecture. Add the friction. Reduce the monitoring during volatile periods. Because the version of you sitting calmly at your desk right now is the best decision maker you have access to. The version of you in month 2 of a steep decline, running on accumulated loss signals and peak availability cascade, is a different person with access to the same account. Give the calm version the authority. Put it in writing. And the next time that window opens, and it will, you'll already know what you decided. If this raised more questions than it answered, particularly around what a real investment policy statement looks like and why the one specific step most people skip is the one that does the most work, that's exactly what's coming next.